The year was 542 AD, and the Gothic War had entered its 6th year. On a cool spring morning near Faventia, the Gothic king Totila prepared his forces. Across a valley at the foothills of the northern Apennines, the Byzantine army, led by generals Constantian and Alexander, had fortified their camp. Sent by Emperor Justinian to reclaim Italy for the Eastern Roman Empire, they now stood ready to face Totila in battle. For 6 years, the Byzantines had dominated the war. Weak Gothic leadership and internal divisions had allowed them to retake much of Italy, Rome included, bringing most of the peninsula back under imperial control. But Totila's rise had changed everything. In a short time, he had rallied his forces, launching a counteroffensive that threatened to undo years of Byzantine gains. Yet, Emperor Justinian, unwilling to let his victories slip away, continued to send armies to crush the Gothic resistance. The Byzantine forces at Faventia numbered around 12,000 against Attila's host of 5,000. But although they enjoyed a numerical advantage, their position was far from secure. Supplies were running low, and morale had faltered after their failed attempt to take Verona the previous year. Now, the Byzantines found themselves divided. In their war council, Constantian urged caution, wary that Totila might be luring them into an ambush. Alexander, impatient and eager for battle, dismissed his concerns and demanded an immediate assault. Their hesitation cost them valuable time, exactly what Totila had hoped for. Totila had drilled his men well, ensuring they held their ground and resisted the urge to break ranks. Unlike their opponents, there was no confusion in their command. They had chosen their battlefield carefully. The rolling plains near Faventia, with open ground favoring their cavalry, suited their strategy perfectly. As the Byzantines wavered between caution and action, Totila seized the moment. Soon, Faventia would witness not just another clash in the Gothic War, but a decisive battle. By the 6th century, the Italian peninsula, once the beating heart of the Roman Empire, had become a shadow of its former self. Though still a beacon of late antiquity, its political and military importance had waned as the world entered the 1st century of the so-called Middle Ages. The imperial throne in the west had fallen in 476 AD when the Germanic warlord and usurper Odoacer marched into Rome, deposed the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, and declared himself ruler of Italy. And thus, the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist. Yet rather than plunging into chaos, Italy became the center of a new kingdom, the Ostrogothic Kingdom. In 493 AD, Theodoric the Great seized power. A warrior king who straddled both Gothic and Roman worlds, Theodoric had been sent to Italy by the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno to remove Odoacer. After a prolonged campaign, Theodoric personally killed Odoacer at a banquet, securing his own rule. Though he never claimed the imperial title, he governed Italy as a king in all but name, preserving much of Rome's administrative and legal framework. Under his leadership, Italy flourished, enjoying a period of relative stability and prosperity. But no kingdom, no matter how well governed, can escape the weight of time and ambition. Theodoric's death in 526 marked the beginning of a rapid decline. His chosen successor, Athalaric, was only 10 years old, leaving real power in the hands of Theodoric's daughter, Amalasuntha. Considered to be too steeped in Roman traditions, she faced staunch opposition from the Gothic nobility, who resented her pro-Roman policies. When Athalaric died in 534, she attempted to maintain control by allying with her cousin, Theodahad, but he betrayed her, had her imprisoned, and ultimately executed. Theodahad, however, proved to be an incapable and cowardly ruler, and his incompetence led to his overthrow by Vitiges just 2 years later, but the damage was already done. The Ostrogothic Kingdom, once powerful and united under Theodoric the Great, had become weak, divided, and vulnerable. And from his throne in Constantinople, a new and exceptionally powerful player to be in the coming war, watched and waited for the perfect moment to strike. In 527, just 1 year after the death of Theodoric, Emperor Justinian I ascended the Roman throne. Where his predecessors had been content to defend their shrinking empire, Justinian sought to restore Rome to its former glory. His vision, the Renovatio Imperii, was nothing less than the rebirth of ancient Rome under his rule. Born into a peasant family of either Thracian or Illyrian stock, Justinian rose through the ranks with the support of his uncle, Emperor Justin I, a former swineherd-turned-soldier who, like so many pretenders before him in both the East and West, secured the throne through martial prowess and political savvy, despite his humble origins, thus founding the Justinian dynasty. Justinian's keen intellect and political acumen saw him rise through the ranks, starting as a member of his uncle's imperial bodyguard, then becoming his most trusted advisor, and eventually serving as the empire's de facto regent in Justin's later years. Upon Justin's death, Justinian swiftly ascended the throne, driven by relentless ambition and an unshakable belief in his divine mandate to reunite the empire. Italy's instability under its Germanic overlords presented him with a golden opportunity. To justify his intervention, he positioned himself as the legitimate protector of Rome and its people. But behind this rhetoric lay a stark reality. His goal was not just restoration, but imperial conquest by any means necessary. At his side stood one of history's most gifted commanders, Belisarius, young, audacious, and already legendary for his victories against the Sassanid Persians. A man of brilliant tactics and loyalty, he was the empire's greatest weapon. In 533, Belisarius had already led an army of 15,000 men against the once mighty Vandal kingdom in North Africa. Within months, the Vandals were obliterated and their kingdom annexed. With North Africa secured, Justinian turned his gaze towards Italy. It was with a bitter twist of fate that one of the most ruinous wars in Italian history began with an expedition from Carthage, once Rome's greatest enemy. This time, it was Byzantine soldiers, not Carthaginians, who set sail for the peninsula, seeking not to destroy Rome, but to reclaim it. In 535, Belisarius and his legions set sail. The Gothic War had begun. The Gothic War began with rapid Byzantine advances. In 535, Belisarius landed in Sicily, securing the island with little resistance before reaching the Italian mainland. The first major test of the war came at the siege of Naples. The city's defenders, loyal to the Ostrogothic Kingdom after more than half a century of Germanic rule, resisted fiercely, unwilling to surrender their walls to the Byzantine invaders. The siege dragged on, but Belisarius, known for his resourcefulness, discovered a hidden aqueduct passage leading inside the city. The Byzantine troops infiltrated Naples, opening the gates from within. What followed was a brutal sack. The Eastern Roman army, many of whom were of Germanic descent themselves, enraged by the city's dogged resistance, unleashed their ruin upon the population. Naples had fallen, and with it, the path to Rome lay open. Meanwhile, in Ravenna, the Ostrogothic Kingdom's capital since the reign of Theodoric, tensions within the Gothic court were reaching a breaking point. King Theodahad had ascended the throne in 534, following the death of his predecessor, Athalaric. More interested in philosophy than war, Theodahad stood no chance of stopping the Byzantine invasion, let alone outmaneuvering a military genius like Belisarius. As the Byzantine general pressed deeper into Italy, the Gothic nobles, furious at their king's inaction, turned against him. In late 536, he was overthrown and executed. In his place, they elected Vitiges, a seasoned warrior determined to reclaim the lands so rapidly lost to the Byzantines. Yet, when Belisarius reached Rome, there was no grand battle for its possession. In December, Belisarius and his army marched into Rome unopposed, taking control of the city for the first time in nearly 60 years. The Gothic garrison, rather than fight for the eternal city, simply abandoned it, believing it indefensible. It was an eerily easy conquest, perhaps too easy in fact, but Vitiges had no intention of letting Rome slip away so easily. The apparent retreat was no act of cowardice, but a calculated move. By yielding the city without resistance, the Goths lured Belisarius into an isolated position, deep within enemy territory. In early 537, Vitiges returned, leading a massive army of nearly 50,000 men, vastly outnumbering the Byzantine force. Rome was now under siege, and Belisarius found himself trapped. For over a year, from March 537 to 538, the Goths relentlessly assaulted the city, hurling their full strength against its ancient walls. But Rome was no ordinary stronghold, and Belisarius, a master of defense, turned the city and its high walls into an unbreakable bastion. The Byzantines repelled attack after attack, using superior discipline, siege tactics, and cavalry strikes to weaken the Gothic army. Despite months of sallies, assaults, and engagements, Vitiges could not breach the defenses. The siege dragged on, and as whispers of Byzantine reinforcements from the east spread, the Gothic resolve began to crack. By March 538, with no victory in sight and his own forces dwindling, Vitiges made a tough decision. He lifted the siege and withdrew to Ravenna. The Eternal City had held firm, and with it, the Byzantine war effort as the Eastern Roman legions advanced north. After the Gothic king retreated once more to Ravenna, he attempted to negotiate with the Byzantines, even offering them control of Italy in exchange for a high-ranking position. But his efforts were in vain. In 540, Belisarius captured the Gothic capital city through a mix of military pressure and diplomacy, convincing the Gothic nobility that he intended to rule a partitioned Italy as their new king. Once inside, he took control of the city with minimal bloodshed, deposed Vitiges, and sent him as a prisoner to Constantinople. As a reward for his surrender, Vitiges was granted the rank of patrician before spending the rest of his days in comfortable captivity. With Vitiges out of the picture and their capital lost, the Ostrogothic Kingdom was on the brink of collapse. Yet the Byzantines struggled to secure their hold on Italy. In the same year Ravenna fell, another important event occurred. Belisarius was recalled to the east to confront renewed Persian aggression, or perhaps due to Justinian's jealousy over his general's growing influence. The Byzantine forces were placed under the command of two generals, Constantian and Alexander. The Byzantine army now lacked their experienced and talented leader, but despite his departure, the situation remained dire for the Goths. In a last-ditch effort, they rallied behind a new leader in 541, Totilla. A kinsman of Theudis, king of the Visigoths and sword-bearer of Theodoric the Great himself. Totilla abandoned the conventional defensive strategies that had led to disaster. Instead of fortifying key cities and waiting for the enemy, he took the fight to the Byzantines themselves, waging a relentless guerrilla campaign, striking Roman forces in isolated areas and cutting off their supply lines. His strategy proved devastatingly effective, as he recaptured key cities in the Po Plain, such as Verona in 541 and Bologna in 542, instantly turning the tide of the war. What truly set Totila apart, however, was his treatment of the local Latin population. Unlike previous Gothic rulers, he sought to win the support of the common folk by protecting their lands and livelihoods whenever possible. This stood in stark contrast to the Byzantine administrators, who immediately imposed harsh taxes and forced conscription on the weary populace in an effort to win the war as quickly as possible. Even Procopius, the staunchly pro-Byzantine historian, acknowledged the shifting tides of loyalty in Italy. Ironically, the Romans, once the rightful rulers of the land, were now seen as oppressors, while Totila, a foreign Goth, was viewed as a noble leader, a liberator of slaves, and a protector of the lowborn. But Totila was not merely a reformer, he was a commander intent on reversing the fortunes of his people. After several crushing defeats in the early years of the war, the tide was beginning to turn. Totila rebuilt his forces, winning a series of smaller victories that restored morale and convinced many that the war was far from over. By 542, Totila had steadfastly restored the Gothic military's strength and morale, and with momentum on his side after his victories at Bologna and Verona, he felt he was ready to confront the Byzantine army in open battle. Meanwhile, a Byzantine force under Constantian and Alexander moved to intercept him. The two opposing armies converged near Faventia, a strategic point in northern Italy, near the recently recaptured cities of Bologna and Verona, and a stone's throw from the capital, Ravenna. For the first time in 6 years, the war's outcome was uncertain. This next clash would determine whether Byzantine rule in Italy would hold, or whether the Goths would have a chance at reclaiming their lost kingdom. The Byzantine army at Faventia numbered around 12,000 men, a strong force composed of veteran infantry, archers, and a contingent of heavy cavalry, including the legendary cataphracts and their armored horses. These troops were well-trained, well-equipped, and accustomed to fighting in tight, disciplined formations in typical Roman fashion. However, the quality of their leadership was another matter entirely. After Belisarius was recalled, the Byzantine forces were placed under the command of Constantian and Alexander, two newly appointed generals who lacked both the strategic abilities and battlefield presence of their predecessor. Constantian, though competent in logistics, was rigid in his approach to warfare, favoring conventional Roman tactics despite the ever-changing nature of the conflict. Alexander, on the other hand, was noted by Procopius as simply being inexperienced and indecisive in the heat of battle. Their leadership would prove to be a liability against Totila. In contrast, Totila's Gothic army was smaller, numbering approximately 5,000 warriors. However, what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in mobility and morale. The Gothic cavalry in particular was an imposing force, light, fast, and highly skilled in hit-and-run tactics. Totila himself was a master of psychological warfare, using feints, ambushes, and deception to keep his enemies off balance. The plains near Faventia, modern-day Faenza in northeastern Italy, between Bologna and Ravenna, provided an ideal setting for Totila's tactics. The terrain was a mix of open fields and low-lying hills to the south of the settlement, offering ample opportunities for concealed movements and sudden charges. Totila had anticipated a Byzantine attack near Ravenna, where his forces had been lying in wait since the fall of Rome, and he carefully studied the landscape, identifying key positions where his cavalry could hide and launch devastating flanking maneuvers. He knew the Byzantines would expect a conventional engagement, and he was determined to give them anything but. The battle began with the Byzantines advancing westward from the modern village of Ritortolo in their traditional triplex aces formation, 3 battle lines of infantry, with cavalry reserves positioned on the wings. The front ranks bristled with spears, while archers positioned behind them prepared to unleash volleys of arrows. Constantian, confident in his numerical superiority, ordered a swift and aggressive advance, hoping to crush the Goths in a single decisive engagement. The Byzantine cataphracts, clad in gleaming heavy armor, trotted forward on both flanks with an air of invincibility, while the centrally positioned infantry marched in a tight lockstep formation. But Totila had no intention of fighting a conventional battle. He deployed his forces in a deliberately weak-looking formation, with a thin line of skirmishers and light infantry at the front. These men, mostly archers and javelin throwers, were lightly equipped and moved with apparent uncertainty, reinforcing the illusion of a poorly organized Gothic army. As the Byzantines approached, these skirmishers unleashed a brief but concentrated barrage of javelins before feigning a panicked retreat. Their shouts and scattered flight added to the deception, luring the Byzantines into believing they had already routed the Gothic vanguard. The Byzantines, believing they had broken the Gothic line, pursued, stretching their formation and breaking unit cohesion. Totila had positioned his men carefully, ensuring that his riders remained out of sight until the perfect moment. From their hidden positions on the flanks atop the hills northeast of a fortress ruin, the Gothic cavalry surged forward with devastating speed. The slopes gave his cavalry momentum, while the sudden appearance of hundreds of Gothic horsemen sent a wave of panic through the Byzantine ranks. Totila himself led the charge on the right flank, his warriors thundering down the slope and crashing into the exposed Byzantine right. On the left flank, another Gothic cavalry detachment executed a similar movement, stunning the enemy by emerging from the woodlands and striking the other Byzantine flank. Many Byzantine officers had assumed the river would act as a natural barrier, failing to anticipate that Totila's cavalry had forded it earlier under the cover of darkness. When they suddenly emerged from the tree line, the effect was devastating. The impact was catastrophic. The unprepared Byzantine soldiers were cut down in droves, their formations shattered before they could properly react. With both flanks in disarray, the Gothic centre pressed forward, using hit-and-run tactics to further erode the Byzantine cohesion. Foot soldiers with spears and swords darted in to strike at the staggered Byzantine line before falling back behind the advancing Gothic cavalry. Byzantine officers shouted commands, desperately trying to reform their units, but the battlefield had descended into chaos. The battle had now devolved into a swirling melee, with pockets of Byzantine resistance desperately trying to regroup as the Gothic cavalry continued the massacre. Dust and blood filled the air, obscuring the battlefield as men fought in small, desperate skirmishes. Totilla, clad in gleaming armor and riding at the head of his cavalry, remained a visible figure in the chaos, a stark contrast to the Byzantine commanders, whose positions had become uncertain in the confusion. The battlefield was now a chaotic bloodbath. What had begun as a meticulously planned Byzantine offensive had unraveled into a desperate struggle for survival. The once orderly ranks of infantry had fractured into scattered groups, each trying in vain to hold their ground. The Byzantines, initially so confident in their meticulously prepared advance, were now desperately trying to form defensive clusters as the Gothic cavalry cut through their ranks. Shield walls were hastily assembled, but proved ineffective against the swift, coordinated attacks of the Gothic horsemen, who struck with hit-and-run precision before wheeling away to prepare for another charge. Gothic war cries echoed across the fields as their warriors pressed the attack, while the Byzantines, weighed down by their heavy armor, struggled to retreat in the face of unrelenting light cavalry and javelin strikes. Many, exhausted and wounded, collapsed where they stood, trampled by friend and foe alike as the retreat turned into a desperate flight. Constantian, realizing the gravity of the situation, attempted to rally his troops and ordered his cavalry reserves to charge. He galloped across the battlefield, shouting commands, urging his men to stand and fight. But fear had already set in. The disciplined formations he relied upon had shattered beyond repair. However, it was too late. The Gothic horsemen, having routed the flanks, wheeled around and struck the Byzantine rear, turning the retreat into a slaughter. What remained of the Byzantine lines collapsed completely, and the army dissolved into chaos. Men abandoned their weapons, some fleeing blindly into the countryside, others drowning as they tried to ford the Lamona River in panic. The Byzantine army dissolved into chaos. Thousands were killed or captured, and the shattered remnants fled southward in complete disorder. Gothic horsemen harried the fleeing soldiers for miles, cutting down stragglers and seizing supplies. The few Byzantine survivors who managed to regroup did so far from the battlefield, their morale shattered and their ranks depleted. Historical accounts suggest Byzantine casualties numbered between 6,000 and 7,000 men, while the Goths suffered minimal losses due to their superior mobility. Totila ordered a relentless pursuit, ensuring that no organized Byzantine resistance remained in the region. Procopius later recorded the extent of the disaster, describing how the roads leading away from the battlefield were littered with corpses and discarded armor. Many of the captured Byzantines, knowing the Gothic reputation for sparing common soldiers, surrendered willingly, while their officers, marked by their fine armor and banners, were less fortunate. As for Constantian and Alexander, their fate remains uncertain. No clear records mention their deaths, but given the scale of the disaster, their prospects were grim. They may have been killed in the rout, their bodies lost among the thousands who fell that day. If they survived, they almost certainly faced disgrace in the eyes of the imperial court, unlikely to ever command again. The Battle of Faventia was a textbook example of a Roman-style advance turned disastrous, an overlooked yet critical engagement that military scholars still examine as a case study in complete tactical miscalculation. The Byzantine commanders, falling for the age-old Roman mistake of underestimating their Germanic opponents, viewed Totila as little more than a reckless barbarian chieftain. Constantian and Alexander relied too heavily on traditional Roman strategies, failing to adapt to the fluid nature of the conflict or the brilliance of their opponent. Totila, by contrast, was no ordinary adversary. A master of deception and maneuver warfare, he understood that discipline, and rigid formations did not guarantee victory against a more adaptable and cunning foe. This crushing defeat stalled the Byzantine advance in Italy and dealt a severe blow to their war effort. Totila's triumph not only solidified his rule, but also reignited Gothic resistance at a moment when their cause had seemed all but lost. Yet despite this success, the Gothic War was far from over. The Eastern Roman Empire would soon strike back with a vengeance. Justinian's ambition to reclaim the West remained undeterred, and a new Byzantine commander would emerge, one who would usher in the darkest chapter of the war and one of the bleakest in Italy's history. Thank you for watching this video. Please leave a like. It really helps out the channel. If there is a topic, battle, or person you would like to know more about, let me know your thoughts in a comment. I would also like to thank all my patrons and channel members for their generous support. If you enjoy House of History and you want to support my work, consider joining me on Patreon. For just $1 per month, you will gain early access to all my videos without any in-video advertisements. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.